In the summer of 2019, every combine in Calhoun County, Iowa, ran the same harvest management software. This was not a trend. It was infrastructure. The software was what Calhoun County did the way the Raccoon River ran south. Not because anyone had voted on it, but because the alternative had become unthinkable. The county had been harvesting corn and soybeans through hot years and wet years, and every kind of year the Midwest could arrange. The grain elevators were networked to the software. The yield maps were built on its data. The crop insurance adjusters used its output logs as documentation. And in the summer of 2019, with corn at $4.20, a bushel and a late-season weather window that had every agronomist in the state watching the radar with the specific anxiety of someone watching a slow leak, there was not a single operation in Calhoun County that ran harvest without field command running on the cab monitor. Let me tell you about what happened on the morning of September 14th, because it is the reason this story exists. And it is the reason one farm in Calhoun County finished its harvest while the rest of the county waited. The harvest window in central Iowa is not patient. A hard frost will end it. A 3-day rain will cost you 10 points of moisture and a week of drying time that comes out of your margin at the end of the year. The combines go when the window says go, and the window does not negotiate. Every operator in Calhoun County understood this the way they understood tire pressure and fuel consumption as a fact of the work, not a variable. Field command had been the county's standard for 6 years. It managed harvest logistics across a network of combines, grain carts, semi-trucks, and receiving elevators. It optimized load routes in real time. It tracked moisture readings pass by pass, field by field, and adjusted the combine's concave settings automatically based on the data it received from the elevator network. The dealership in Rockwell City had sold the system hard since 2013, and the operations that had adopted it had not looked back. Their harvest efficiency numbers were better. Their grain loss numbers were lower. Their operators could run longer shifts without decision fatigue because the system was handling the logistics overhead that used to live in the farmer's head. On the morning of September 14th, a firmware update pushed automatically overnight to the field command server corrupted the authentication protocol for the entire county's licensed installations. The update had been tested in a lab environment. It had not been tested against the specific combination of legacy cab hardware and regional server load that Calhoun County's network represented. By 5:30 in the morning, every field command terminal in the county was displaying a license verification error. By 6:45, when the first combines should have been rolling into standing corn, the support line for the software company was receiving 340 calls from a 12-county region. The hold time was listed as 47 minutes. The combines were not broken. The corn was ready. The grain carts were fueled, and the semis were staged at the field lanes, and the elevator in Lorville had its receiving pits open and its dryers running. Everything was in place except the software that told each piece of the system what to do with the others. Some operators tried to run without it. One man east of Rockwell City harvested 40 acres in manual mode before he realized his unload timing was off, and he had left a grain cart sitting full at the wrong end of the field with no truck in position to receive it. He stopped. Another operation north of Lake City had 3 semi-staged for a field that their logistics coordinator could not direct without the routing data, and the trucks sat on the county road for 2 hours before anyone admitted that nobody remembered how to sequence the loads without the system telling them. By 8 in the morning, most of Calhoun County's harvest operation had stopped. The software company's support team was working the problem, but their estimate for a fix was 4 to 8 hours. In a harvest window, 4 hours is not a minor inconvenience. It is a number that farmers write down and remember for years. Let me tell you about Bud Fenwick, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did that morning. Bud was 57 years old in the fall of 2019 and had farmed the same 560 acres his father had bought in pieces through the 1970s on the east side of Calhoun County, 9 miles from the elevator in Lorville. His father, Walt Fenwick, had built the operation row by row through years when the margins were thin enough that a single bad decision about timing could end you. Walt had taught Bud to harvest the way you learn a language in a country where nobody speaks anything else, not as a skill you acquire, but as the way things are done. Bud was not a complainer. He was not a man who went to the commodity meetings in Fort Dodge and argued about technology adoption curves, or called the extension office when something new came onto the market, or drove to the farm shows in Des Moines to watch demonstration runs of software he had not asked about. He watched. He had watched Field Command come into the county the way he watched the weather fronts come in off the plains. With attention and without urgency, making a private assessment that he kept to himself. He had not bought Field Command, not because he couldn't run the software, and not because his operation was too small to benefit from it. He hadn't bought it because he had sat down one evening in 2013 with the sales brochure and a notepad and worked through what happened to his harvest if the system went down in the middle of a field on a Thursday afternoon in September. The brochure did not have a good answer for that question. Bud had decided he preferred to know the answer himself. His combine was a 2004 Case IH 2388 that he had bought used in 2009 and maintained with the steady attention of someone who cannot afford to replace what breaks. The cab had a yield monitor and a moisture sensor, both of which he calibrated himself each fall using a method his father had shown him. Sample loads weighed on the elevator's certified scale, cross-referenced against the monitor's reading, adjusted with a correction factor written on a piece of tape stuck to the monitor housing. It was not elegant, it was accurate. His harvest logistics did not run on software. They ran on a whiteboard in the shop and a handheld radio and a routing sequence he had worked out with his grain cart operator, a man named Gene Ackerman, who had been running carts for Bud for 11 years and who could read a field's unload pattern by watching the combine's rooftop exhaust the way a sailor reads a sail. Bud's daughter, Kristen, ran the semi. She was 29 years old and had grown up in the cab of that same 2388 during fall breaks, learning the field patterns before she learned to drive a car. She was not a farmer by profession. She worked as a civil engineer in Ames, but she came home for harvest every year because her father asked her to, and because she understood that the asking was not casual. On the morning of September 14th, Bud Fenwick started his combine at 6:20, ran his pre-operation checklist the way he did every morning: knife condition, feeder house tension, rotor speed set for the moisture reading he had taken from a pulled ear the evening before, and drove to his east field at 6:35. He had not heard about the Field Command outage. He would not hear about it until Gene mentioned it on the radio around 10:30, having gotten a call from his brother-in-law who ran a larger operation near Manson. By 10:30, Bud was on his 19th pass. Let me tell you about what was happening at the Calhoun County elevator in Lorville that same morning, because that is where the other part of this story lives. The elevator manager was a man named Scott Draper, who had been running that facility for 14 years and who had a particular kind of competence that comes from having seen most of the ways a harvest season can go wrong. Scott was not having a good morning. 11 of his 12 major accounts were sitting idle, and his receiving pits were running at a fraction of capacity, and his dryer fuel cost was accruing against a volume that was not coming in. A man named Jeff Callister was in the elevator office when Scott got the fourth call from a stalled operation that morning. Jeff was the regional sales director for AgriLogic Systems, the company that sold and supported Field Command in central Iowa. He was 39 years old, drove a company SUV that was newer than any truck in the elevator parking lot, and had a habit of referring to his client farms as installations rather than operations. He had come to Lorville that morning because 3 of his larger accounts had called before 7. And he was trying to be visible and helpful in a situation that was, by any honest assessment, his company's fault. The update protocol failed in a very specific edge case. He was saying to Scott and the 2 farmers who had come into the office to wait out the hold time on the support line. This is not a systemic issue. It's an isolated authentication error that our team is resolving in real time. The fix will propagate automatically once the server patch is deployed. He said it with the fluency of someone who has been briefed on exactly what to say and has said it enough times that morning that it has started to sound like a fact rather than a hope. One of the farmers, a younger man named Aaron Tillis, who ran a 100-acre corn-soybean operation north of town, asked what the realistic timeline was for the patch. Jeff said, 4 to 8 hours from the original point. Aaron pointed out that the original failure point had been 5:30 in the morning. Jeff said the team was working as fast as they could. It was Scott Draper who mentioned Bud Fenwick. Scott had been watching the elevator's incoming ticket log since the office opened, and one account had been running steady loads all morning while every other account showed nothing. He mentioned it the way you mention something that is simply true, without editorializing. Bud Fenwick's been running since first light, Scott said. He's put in 4 loads already, no field command. He's never used it. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then Jeff Callister said something that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same neighborhood. He shook his head once, a small controlled motion, and said, "That's the thing about running without logistics software. It works fine on a 560-acre operation with 1 combine and 2 people. You scale that up to 1,200 acres with 3 combines and a 6-truck fleet and try to coordinate it without the system." He looked at Aaron. "You'd spend half your day on the radio." Aaron did not smile. He looked at Scott's ticket log for a moment, at Bud Fenwick's name appearing 4 times in a column of zeros, and he did not say anything. "Now let me ask you something, because it is worth asking. Have you ever watched someone explain away a working solution because accepting it would require them to admit that their system was not as essential as they had said it was?" Jeff Callister was not dishonest. He was accurate about the scale argument. A 560-acre operation is not a WIT 200-acre operation, and what works at one scale does not automatically work at another. But he had made the scale argument the entire argument, and in doing so he had avoided the question that was actually in the room, which was not whether field command was useful, but whether the people who used it had any idea how to harvest without it. The scale argument was not about Bud Fenwick. It was about Jeff Callister's professional identity, which was built on the proposition that modern agricultural logistics required modern logistic software. Bud Fenwick, running steady loads into an elevator that was otherwise sitting quiet, was not a counter-argument to that proposition. He was an inconvenience to it. Gene Ackerman radioed Bud around 10:30 and told him what was happening across the county. Bud listened without changing his pace. He came to the end of the pass, made his turn, watched Kristen position the semi at the field lane, and keyed the radio. "Tell her to pull up another 40 feet, he said. "Slope's going to push the load to the front of the box on this stretch." Gene relayed the message. Kristen moved the truck. "You hear me about the field command thing?" Gene asked. "I heard you," Bud said. He made his pass. "Let me tell you about the next 2 days, because the numbers matter." The field command patch deployed at 1:47 in the afternoon. The county's stalled operations came back online and ran through the night and into the following day, and by the evening of September 15th, most of the lost time had been compressed back into the schedule. The window had not been missed. The corn came in, but the weather that had been sitting over the eastern plains moved in on September 16th, 4 hours earlier than the forecast had indicated. It rained hard for 36 hours. The operations that had gotten back online after the patch and run hard for 2 days came through it in reasonable shape. 3 operations that had lost the most time to the outage found themselves caught with corn, still standing when the rain started, and they came out of it with moisture penalties at the elevator that cost them real money against a margin that had not had much give in it. Bud Fenwick had his 560 acres in the bin by the afternoon of September 15th, the day before the rain. The county noticed quietly. 2 operations that had watched Bud's ticker running through Scott Draper's log on the morning of the 14th did the arithmetic on what the outage had cost them and compared it against what a 560-acre operation with a whiteboard and a handheld radio had cleared in the same window. Nobody held a meeting about it. Nobody wrote a letter. But a few farmers who had not thought about what their harvest operation looked like without field command started thinking about it. Jeff Callister drove past Bud Fenwick's east field on September 17th on his way to a client meeting in Rockwell City. Bud's field was harvested and disked, and the combine was back in the shed. Jeff slowed down. He did not stop, but he looked at the stubble field for a long moment before he drove on. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened in November of 2019, because it is the one that carries the most weight. Jeff Callister drove out to Bud Fenwick's farm on a Wednesday morning in the second week of November, after the elevator had settled the season's accounts and the fields were bare and there was frost on the shop roof when he pulled into the yard. He had called ahead, which was something. Bud was in the shop doing post-harvest maintenance on the 2388, feeder house chain tension, cleaning out the grain tank corners, going through the header section by section the way his father had taught him to do it every fall without exception. Jeff stood in the shop door for a moment. Then he walked in. Bud looked up. He waited. "I owe you a better answer than I gave in Scott's office," Jeff said. The scale argument was fair as far as it went. But I used it to dismiss the situation rather than look at it honestly, and that wasn't right. He said it simply, without a lot of packaging around it. Bud set down his wrench. He looked at Jeff for a moment, then he said, "Sit down." Jeff sat on a metal folding chair near the workbench. Bud pulled a stool from under the header cart and sat across from him. The shop smelled like chain lubricant and the dry, particular smell of harvested fields, and the light came through the south window at the flat, low angle of November, and neither man said anything for a beat. "The system you sell is a real system," Bud said. "I'm not arguing that. Optimized routing and real-time moisture adjustment, I can't do that with a whiteboard. I know that." He paused. "But your system needs 3 things to run. It needs power, it needs a server connection, and it needs operators who know what they're doing when it doesn't have those things." He looked at Jeff steadily. "My system needs 2 things. It needs Gene knowing the field, and it needs Kristen knowing the timing. Those 2 things don't have a server." Jeff was quiet. Then he said, "The outage cost my clients about 400 hours of combine time across the region." "I know," Bud said. "Scott told me." "How do you sequence your loads without the routing software?" Jeff asked. It was a genuine question. The kind that comes from a man who has let the defensiveness go, and what is left is just an honest desire to understand something. Bud stood up and walked to the whiteboard mounted on the shop wall. It still had the harvest routing from the season on it in dry erase marker, field names and load sequence numbers, and the estimated pass counts for each grain cart cycle. "You know your combine's bushel per hour rate at full capacity," Bud said. "You know your grain cart capacity. You know how long it takes your semi to make a round trip to the elevator. You do the arithmetic before the season and you write it down." He tapped the whiteboard. "When the corn's wetter than planned, Jean calls it on the radio and Kristen slows her turnaround. When it's drier, she pushes the pace. The system is 3 people who understand the same field." Jeff looked at the whiteboard for a long moment. "Field Command does that calculation in real time with live data from every piece of equipment simultaneously," he said. "Not defensively, just accurately." "It does," Bud said. "And it does it better than I can when everything is working." He looked at Jeff. "But it doesn't do anything at all on a Tuesday morning when the authentication server goes down." Jeff drove back to Rockwell City that afternoon carrying something he had not arrived with: a specific and honest understanding of the gap between what a system can optimize and what a system can survive. He did not stop selling Field Command. It was a good system, and the county needed the efficiency it provided. But he changed a question he asked during his sales consultations that winter. He started asking his prospective clients whether they had a documented harvest protocol that could run without the software. Most of them did not. He started telling them they needed one. "Let me tell you about what happened at the Calhoun County Extension Office in the winter of 2020, because the story does not end in Bud's shop." The extension agronomist that year was a woman named Pat Groves, who had been covering the county for 9 years and who had the particular kind of patience that comes from watching technology adoption cycles from a position that is neither selling the technology nor buying it. Pat had been compiling the harvest efficiency data from the 2019 season, and she had noticed something in the numbers that she wanted to understand. The operations that had lost the most combine time to the September 14th outage had, on average, come into the rain window 46 hours behind the operations that had either not used Field Command or had documented manual backup protocols. In a corn crop sitting at 22% moisture, 46 hours of additional field time before a rain event translated directly to drying costs and moisture penalties. The difference in net revenue per acre between the operations that made it in before the rain and those that did not was between $28 and $41 per acre, depending on the elevator and the contract. Pat put that range in her winter newsletter. She did not name Bud Fenwick. She did not say anything about whiteboards or handheld radios or manual load sequencing. She simply noted that the September outage had created an unplanned test of harvest operation resilience, and that the results were consistent with what the research literature said about the relationship between logistical redundancy and risk exposure. She suggested that operations consider whether their harvest workflow had a documented fallback for primary system failure. The newsletter went to 410 farms in Calhoun County. Bud Fenwick read it at his kitchen table on a February morning, set it down, poured more coffee, and did not say anything about it to anyone. But 7 farmers called the extension office that winter, asking about manual harvest sequencing protocols. Pat Groves referred 3 of them to Bud Fenwick. 2 of those 3 drove out to his farm in March when the ground was still frozen and there was nothing in the fields but last year's residue, and spent an afternoon in the shop while Bud walked them through the whiteboard method, the radio protocol, the arithmetic for load sequencing, and the field-specific adjustments for terrain and moisture variability. He showed them the way his father had shown him, going through the steps in order, answering questions when they came, not elaborating beyond what was asked. One of those 2 farmers was Aaron Tillis, who had been standing in Scott Draper's office on the morning of September 14th, listening to Jeff Callister's scale argument. Aaron was 34 years old, had been running field command for 5 years, and had never conducted a harvest operation without software managing his logistics. He sat in Bud's shop for most of that March afternoon and asked questions that went well past the whiteboard method into the underlying logic of how you make time-critical decisions without data aggregation, how you build operator judgment as a system rather than as a backup. At the end of the afternoon, he asked Bud if he could come back in the fall and watch one full harvest day before he tried to run his own manual protocol. Bud said yes. Let me tell you about the fall of 2020, because it is where the story turns towards something longer than itself. Aaron Tillis came out to Bud's farm on the first morning of harvest, an hour before first light, and stood at the edge of the east field and watched Bud and Jean and Kristen run through their pre-start walkthrough. He watched the whiteboard review. He watched the radio check. He watched Bud pull an ear from the edge of the field and crack it and run the kernels through the handheld moisture meter and write the number on the board next to the field name. He watched the combine roll in at first light and begin the opening passes, and he watched Jean read the discharge pattern and position the cart, and he watched Kristen on the radio with Jean coordinating the semi-timing, and he watched all three of them adjusting continuously to what was actually happening in the field rather than to what the software had predicted would happen. He watched Bud come off the field for a fuel stop at mid-morning, and he walked over and asked one question. How do you know when to trust Jean's call over the plan? Bud looked at him for a moment, then he said, Jean's been running this field for 11 years. The plan is built on averages. Jean is standing in the specific. Aaron thought about that for the rest of the day. He went home and wrote a manual harvest protocol for his own operation. He kept field command. He was not Bud Fenwick and did not want to be. But he had a fallback now, and the fallback was documented, and his operators had read it and understood it, and on a Tuesday morning in September, when a software server had a problem, he would know what to do. In September of 2021, Field Command ran without interruption. Aaron's harvest was clean and on schedule, and he used the software the entire season, and it worked the way good systems work when everything is functioning correctly. But his manual protocol binder sat in the cab of the combine, where his lead operator could reach it. In August of 2022, a lightning strike took out the regional AgriLogic server for 11 hours during pre-harvest preparation week. Aaron ran his field prep routing manually. His operation did not stop. Let me tell you one last thing about Bud Fenwick, because the story has one more place to go. In the fall of 2023, Bud's son-in-law, a man named Cody Marsh, came back from 4 years managing precision agriculture on a 6,000-acre operation in southern Minnesota to help Bud with the transition toward eventual retirement. Cody was 31 years old and had spent those 4 years running equipment and software that made Bud's 2388 look like a different era. Variable rate seeding, automated field scouting, harvest logistics systems that could coordinate a fleet of 12 combines across multiple farms simultaneously. He was good at it. He had grown up watching Bud work and had spent his career building a different kind of fluency on top of that foundation. Cody sat with Bud at the kitchen table in October of 2023 and talked about what a modernized operation might look like on the Fenwick ground. Better equipment, newer cab technology, proper logistics software, the kind of infrastructure that would allow the farm to scale if that was ever the direction. Bud listened to all of it. He didn't argue. He said, all of that makes sense. Do what you think is right. And then he said, but before you put any of it in, run one harvest season with the whiteboard. So you understand what you're automating, and so you know what to do when the automation stops. Cody looked at his father-in-law for a moment. He was thinking about the 4 years in Minnesota, the millions of bushels he had moved with logistics software, the way the system could see the entire operation simultaneously and optimize it faster than any person could. He was thinking about whether the request was practical preparation or sentimental attachment. Then he thought about September of 2019, which he had heard about from Kristen and from Jean and from at least 3 people at the elevator over the years. And he said, okay, he harvested the fall of 2024 with the whiteboard and the radios and Gene Ackerman, who was 58 years old now and had been running carts for the Fenwick operation for 16 years, and who taught Cody things about reading a field's discharge pattern that no yield monitor had ever captured in a data point. It was the hardest harvest Cody had ever run. Holding the entire logistical sequence in his head, trusting Gene's read of the field, coordinating with Kristen on timing without a system, telling all 3 of them simultaneously where to be, it was cognitive work in a way that software-managed harvest was not. By the end of the first week, he had stopped trying to hold everything at once and started trusting the protocol, the way you stop trying to remember the words to something you've heard enough times and start just knowing them. He put field command on the operation the following spring. He used it from the first day of harvest, and it worked exactly as advertised, and his efficiency numbers in the first season were meaningfully better than the whiteboard numbers had been. But the manual protocol binder was in the combine cab, and Gene had helped him write it, and Kristen had reviewed it, and Cody understood every number in it because he had lived the arithmetic for a full season before he let a system do it for him. Bud Fenwick is 61 years old now and does not run the combine himself anymore. He walks the field sometimes in the evenings the way his father used to, looking at residue breakdown and tile drainage, and the things that show themselves to you only after decades of looking at the same ground. Cody runs the operation. The 2388 is in the shed, maintained, starts on the second crank. Cody has not decided what to do with it. His daughter is 7 years old and has already told him she wants to drive the big green combine when she is old enough. Cody has told her she can, and that when she does, he will show her how to read the discharge pattern the way Gene showed him, and how to set the load sequence on a whiteboard before the first pass, and how to call your cart operator on the radio and tell him what you need because you have looked at the field and know what is coming, and not because a server in a building somewhere has processed that information for you. The software told every combine in Calhoun County to stop on the morning of September 14, 2019. One farmer who had never handed his logistics to a server finished his harvest before the rain came. His loads ran on time. His corn came in dry. His margin in a year when every dollar counted was built on arithmetic that lived on a whiteboard and in 3 people who knew the same field. Some knowledge does not get replaced. It gets inherited or it gets lost. And the difference between those 2 outcomes is whether someone thought to pass it on before the moment it was needed again.